And before I let Julia introduce George, I want to say a quick word about why we're doing this, because it's part of kind of a larger plan. And I know we're interrupting some of what we're doing in Old Fashioned, for example, but I think the greater good here is to take things that are important to us in our life, like the Homeless Requiem, other things that we do, and add an educational component to them, right? So the idea, much like in our Godly Play curriculum, is that we take our experiences of God and then we get some language with which to work with them. So we'll continue to do this, to use this forum as a way to integrate the good things we're already doing. I'll have more to say about that later. Right now, here's our preacher, Julia Minchner.
Thank you, George, and thank you all for being here, including, I see some members of the Living Faith class. Thank you all for joining in. It wasn't just that I wanted to be here, which I did, but that's not the only reason we're in here instead of in Living Faith today. I just think that this is such an important topic that our guest speaker is going to be talking about today. And so thank you all for your presence here. As George mentioned, this is part of our lead up to the 36th annual Homeless Requiem on Friday, November 1st. And this is the second year that we have had a speaker come to share with us about some dimension of homelessness, housing insecurity. Last year we had someone who, a very respected leader in the community, and who gave us a lot of statistics as well as stories, and it was very good. Today we are going to have a very personal, and what I have already experienced is a very powerful narrative from George Franklin. George and Molly Franklin have been involved actively here at the cathedral for quite some time. George had a rich and varied history in terms of his life's work. Well, not that varied, I guess. It was a lot of it has to do with food, which was one of the first things that drew me to George. No, not really. But George was a lawyer and lobbyist for many years. He lobbied in Washington on behalf of the food industry. He later, I believe afterwards, or perhaps before, became vice president at the Kellogg Company. And in addition, he is also, can't forget this, he is the author of 4 books. I think this is something you've done more in your retirement, George, correct? And there's a website that you should really check out where you can get copies of his books, and they are all about, I think, basically your years in Washington, correct? And they sound fabulous. I'm particularly interested in the one called, I believe, Raisin Bran and Other Cereal Wars. Yes, so George is a published author as well. Most recently, in his retirement, he and his wife, Molly, have taken on advocacy for mental health services. We all know, I think, that we have a great dearth. We don't have nearly enough mental health resources in our country for anyone, even those who can pay for it. But particularly for the most vulnerable among us, and particularly those who are unhoused or are living with housing insecurity, which is oftentimes, as you'll hear from George, directly tied in with lack of access to proper mental health care. But that vulnerable population particularly lacks access to mental health care. And so today, George is going to share with us some of his personal experience with this tragedy, this challenge, this dilemma, and is also going to talk some about the advocacy work that he does now in response to a very personal experience he and his family had. So without further ado, I give you George Franklin.
Thank you, Reverend. I think you want me using this, right? Can you hear me? Well, first of all, thank you for being here. This is a special place for us. Molly and I got married here 19 years ago. I think that was right. 19. Yeah. But it's a special place, and we love St. Philip's. And thank you for being here. I've left around. There's some extra ones here. There was a Wall Street Journal article about my homeless sister last January, and I did an opinion piece for the AJC last March, and so we've left both of those as handouts. And I'd like you to imagine getting a phone call from a total stranger who tells you your sister is a homeless person 500 miles away. And I usually don't answer the phone because, as you mentioned, my life was in politics, and it's usually a politician looking for money. But it was an area code that was local, so I picked it up. And the woman says, "Are you Joe Franklin's brother?" And I said, yeah. I said, "Who are you?" And she said, "Well, I used to be an intern for your sister when she was making documentaries." And I'm like, this is a scam, right? I mean, who is this person? I haven't seen my sister in 13 years at this point. And she said, "Yeah, your sister, I just found out, is a homeless person in Palm Beach Gardens." In my wildest imaginations, I could not imagine that. My sister had been the producer of the McNeil-Lehrer Report. Many of you might remember that. It was trend-setting. It was prior to the PBS NewsHour. She was one of the youngest producers. She had made documentaries, famous documentaries, that appeared in PBS and around the world. And all of a sudden, this woman is telling me, "Your sister is a homeless person in Palm Beach Gardens." And if I leave here with one thought for you, I ask you, those people, they're brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, uncles, and aunts. They're people just like you. And you think it can't happen to you, it can. And what I also found out is when I went to help my sister, is I was told repeatedly throughout the whole episode before she died a lonely death, there was, quote, "nothing you can do." And they were right. They were very right. My sister, we grew up in an upper middle class family in the south side of Chicago. We went to fancy schools. We belonged to the country club. We had every privilege you could imagine. The idea that she would go from there to living under the steps of the Embassy Suites Hotel was totally implausible. But it happened. And how it happened was, when she was a young woman and she was a professional in Washington, the demons of mental illness started taking her over. She had married a vascular surgeon who was very successful, a wonderful guy. They had 2 children, son and a daughter. They went to Georgetown Prep School or one of those fancy schools up there. I mean, they had the life. It was the perfect life. But the demons of mental illness started taking hold. And her stories became more fantastical and fantastical. And it got to the point where my father, who was 94 years old, living in Tampa, Florida, called me one day and said, "I need to talk to you." So I go to see my father, and he said, "Your sister's not right, and you're going to have to take care of her at some point." And so I promised my father I would, not ever believing I'd really have to. But their life in Washington started to unravel. She had these wild ideas that she had written this book and it was going to be made into a movie, and Omar Sharif wanted to be the lead role, and Lord knows who else. And it just, the craziness just grew and grew and grew until a point which she basically left her family and moved to California. And as I'll talk about her son and daughter, they were the collateral damage in this whole thing. They were 8 and 10 years old, and their mom left them. And then she would actually, connect with them now and then or talk to them. And it got to the point where Ashley, the daughter, was in Japan on a school trip kind of thing and got hurt. And Joanne, my sister Joanne, calls her and says, Colin Powell is sending the State Department plane to come get you, and craziness. And finally, Ashley, she said, Mom, I can't take it anymore. I'm done. I can't take the lies. I can't take this whole craziness that you've instilled in our family. I'm done. And so she became totally estranged from our family. And we knew she was in California. We didn't know what she was doing. My other sister and I actually hired a private investigator one day to try to find her. And all he could find was, she had, scammed people on this and conned people out of that. And where she lived, we couldn't figure out until I got this call. And back to this call. So I asked this woman, I said, once again, I thought, this is a scam, right? This cannot be true. And I said, how do you know her? And she said, well, once again, I was her intern. She was my role model. She was my mentor. I wanted to be your sister, and I'm writing a book about growing up Arab American in the United States, and I wanted to talk to her about being her intern. And so I tried one last thing. I said, well, do you know who Jack Nelson is? Jack Nelson was the head of the LA Times Washington office. He did a couple of the presidential debates, and they've been friends of my sister and her husband. She goes, oh yeah, Jack Nelson, LA Times. I said, whoa. And so I said, well, how do you know she's homeless? She said, well, I have the police video cams of her under the steps in the parking garage. And I promised my wife I would not cuss, but I did say I said, you're kidding me. And she said, I'll send them to you. So she sends me this police video cam of two wonderful cops in the middle of the night, the Embassy Suites Hotel in Palm Beach Gardens, pulling my sister out who's living underneath the steps. I could not believe what I was seeing. Then she says, I'll send you the police report. So she sends me the police report, mug shots of her, she'd been arrested shoplifting from the CVS. She's a bag lady. So, and I'll have to cuss a little bit. I said, what the hell do I do now? Sorry, Reverend. I did go to Jesuit high school, okay. So I decided, well, I'm gonna call the Palm Beach Gardens Police Department. And then I thought, I don't even know who to ask for. And they're gonna say, who is this guy? So I sent an email to Palm Beach Gardens Police Department. I said, my name is George Franklin. I believe my sister is homeless. She's living down there. We're trying to find her. And 15 minutes later, Officer Castanera calls me. And let me tell you one thing, the cops in this whole episode throughout it were wonderful and have been wonderful. I get the phone, Officer Castanera. He said, oh yeah, we all know who your sister is. She wanders around a little 6-block area. She doesn't harm anybody. She just tends to herself, and yeah, she's homeless. And we all know her. And I'm going, what in the world do I do now? And he said, yeah. I said, well, I'm going to come down there. And Officer Castanera says, sure, come on down. And then about 30 minutes later, Officer Castanera calls me, and he goes, I've got your sister. I hadn't had no idea in 13 years. And he's in his squad car, and he holds the phone out. He goes, Josephine, I've got your brother on the phone. He wants to talk with you. And then he goes to me, he goes, nah, she's ignoring me. He goes, let me try one more time. He says, Josephine, I've got your brother George on the phone. All he wants to do is help you. And he said, she won't acknowledge me. So I get on a plane, I fly down there, and it's a long-winded way, but she had been befriended by a wonderful group of people at a Starbucks, people that regular at Starbucks. And she would go in there, and they got to know her, and they'd sort of adopted her. And over a period of time, she would tell them she's making these documentaries and once again, all these crazy tales about what she was doing. And they figured out she's basically homeless, okay? And I got a hold of, we used to call her the head Starbucks lady, Michelle. And she said, what she has a routine. So I went down there and we decided, I didn't want to spook her, right? We knew where she was. It was in an area we knew where she was. So I flew down there and went to this strip mall. There was a Publix, there was a Starbucks, sort of typical thing. And I drive up there, and I'm like Junior Dick Tracy. I literally have sunglasses and a baseball cap because I don't want her to recognize me. So I'm in the parking lot, and here's my sister, the bag lady. And I cried. And anyway, so I followed her. I jumped out of the car and followed her. And she went across this huge intersection to a parking garage where she sat on a bench just by herself, sort of looking off into space. And so I sat there and followed her, and then she finally got up after 45 minutes or so and walked to another garage where she was living under the steps. And then I went to see Officer Castanera at the police headquarters. And I said, what can I do? And he said, there's nothing you can do. I said, what do you mean there's nothing I can do? He said, I'm just telling you, there's nothing you can do. Unless she's a threat to herself, others, to her threat, herself, or others, or agrees to medical treatment, there's nothing you can do. And I said, well, this is the craziness. You mean I can't get her medical attention? She's ill. She has mental illness. It's like having cancer. And you mean I can't get her to a hospital to have treated for her illness? And he said, there's nothing you can do. I said, she's incapable. And once again, I'm not arguing with him. I'm just trying. I said, she's incapable of agreeing. That's the whole point. There's sort of three sets of people out there that are homeless. There's economic homeless, there's addiction, and there's mentally ill. Well, if you're mentally ill, you can't agree. And the question I keep raising to people, I've raised it with political leaders, I've raised it with lawyers, I've raised it with social workers, and no one can answer this question. If you walk out of here right now in front of this cathedral and you collapse with an aneurysm, we don't stand around and say, when he wakes up, we'll ask him would he like to go to the hospital. We'll wait because, that's his call. He has civil liberties that have to be protected. So we're going to wait till he wakes up because he may not want to go. No, what we do is we call an ambulance and they come without your permission. They put you in that ambulance. They take you to the hospital where they try to fix you without your permission. I couldn't call an ambulance for my sister. I couldn't call. And I'll raise the political. You know what? It's where the far right and the far left meet. Because the far right politicians got all these civil liberties and things, and the left got all these liberties. And you know what? The who suffers in the middle is the mentally ill person. Because they got all these notions of liberty and freedoms. Well, my sister died with all her liberties intact. But no one can answer me that question. How do you take them without their permission? Yet I couldn't take her. So anyways, there's a little bright light in this. So I went to the Starbucks gang. There's about 15 or 16 of them who had sort of adopted her. And it was Michelle that came up with the idea. Michelle, she said, I got an idea. She said, if you'll rent an apartment, I can probably trick her into apartment sitting for me. Because she keeps telling us that she lives on Jupiter Island and she comes over here to work on a documentary and the driver brings her and, it's this totally delusional life. He said, but, I thought, at least I can get her out from under the steps, okay? So Michelle and the gang, I fly back to Atlanta. they find an apartment. We rent it. I've never seen it. I told a little white lie about we might stay there, but that's okay. We'll get redemption later. Anyway, so I sign up for this apartment. And then the wonderful scene, I'm not sure, I think there might be a picture in the Wall Street Journal. The Starbucks ladies all donated furniture to sparsely furnish this. They put it in there, and then they tricked my sister into thinking they were apartment sitting. So we've got her out of the garage. I can't get her medical care, though. The ultimate solution is getting her medical attention. I can't get her there. I'm talking to lawyers. I'm talking to judges, former judges. I'm talking to everybody in the sun. So then, about 6 months after, 3 or 4 months, 6, it doesn't matter. I told Molly, my wife, I said, I better go check on this apartment. I have no idea. Is this thing a meth lab? Are there all sorts of homeless people living there? I mean, I have a responsibility to the landlord. I can't just destroy his apartment just because I'm trying to save my sister. So once again, I fly down to Palm Beach Gardens, and the kind of funny part, if there's anything funny, was supposedly they had left me the key underneath the front door, and they were going to meet my sister at Starbucks. And so once again, I stake out her place. She goes walking down the street with her bags and things to Starbucks. And I go to get the key to get in the front door, and it doesn't work. And I'm like, holy God. And the next door neighbor's door is right there. So I thought, well, in my misguided youth, I knew how to do these things, so I broke in, okay? And I thought, I'm gonna get arrested breaking in my own apartment, but what the heck? And I got in there, and it was so sad. It was it was the bleakest life I could imagine. And I've got to say, Reverend, you use the term unhoused. I hate that term. My sister was housed, but she was homeless. You know, life is more than having a roof over your head. And she was homeless, you know, in that apartment. So I got a hold of her kids, who are young professional, put a pitch in. Ashley, she owns her own winery out in Walla Walla called Brook and Bull. And when you're not buying my books, you can buy her wine, by the way. Or you may need her wine after you read my book, so do that. But I finally got a hold of 2 of them, and I said, guys, you know, I can keep paying for this apartment forever. But I said, the only way we're going to get some movement here is if you 2 come back on the scene. Because she had talked to the Starbucks ladies about how she was in touch with her kids and how close they were. She had never seen her kids' kids. She had never been at her kids' weddings. She had no involvement with her kids over 14 years. They wanted nothing to do with her, and despite what she said, she wanted nothing to do with them. So Hugh, little Hugh we called him, he said, let me give it a try. So he wrote her an email. We know this email is good. He said, Mom, you know, Ashley and I have been talking, and we think it's time we reconnect. You know, let's try to, you know, get our lives back together. No response. So a month or 2 later, Ashley, the daughter, who was actually the tougher nut to crack, I'm surprised she did this. She said, well, I'll write her. So she writes her. No response. And yet she's telling the Starbucks people how the grandchildren are and showing pictures on Facebook and, you know. So my last opportunity was, you know, the lease is running out, and I had an appointment with a lawyer down there, what I called the nuclear option, which is, I always mispronounce this word, conservatorship, okay? That's like the nuclear option. You just take over the person's life. And the lawyer I talked to, she said, you know, it's a Hail Mary pass. She said, be honest, I don't think it would work, but I said, I'll try anything, you know? I don't know what else to do, you know? Well, God sort of intervened. I get a call from the landlord, and he said, George, we have a problem. The landlord lived about an hour away in Fort Lauderdale, and he said, there's a horrible smell coming from the apartment. And he says, I've called for a wellness check. And we both sort of knew, So I said, okay. So I called Palm Beach Gardens. I know all the cops by then. We're like first name basis. Here's George again. I says, Officer Castanera around. He said, no, actually, he's on that call. And so they said, well, I explained who I was, and the woman at the desk said, well, let me transfer you. So she transferred me, and actually an officer, Sanchez, answers the phone. And he said, who are you again? And I explained it. He said, well, I hate to tell you this over the phone, but your sister has died. She's gone. Which was good. There was no good ending. This is a tale without the happy ending. Lassie doesn't come home. But it's the stark reality of what we have here. And so little Hugh came down to thank the Starbucks gang. So I called him ahead and I said, I'm coming down with little Hugh and we're going to clean out the apartment and do all that sort of thing. And this was incredible. 16 people came to Starbucks with condolence cards, little gifts. It was incredible. But anyways, it was like I said, without a happy ending. And then I talked to Hugh and Ashley. I said, well, we can all just go on with our lives and, move along, look all of this in the past mirror. Or we can do something about it. And so you'll see the Wall Street Journal article. It was John Camp, who's a reporter, and he'd written an article in the Wall Street Journal about homelessness. So I popped him a note, and I said, I really enjoy your work, and I've been following it, but, here's a thought or two. And I mentioned, I've lived through this in the last year or so. And he wrote me back, and he said, can we talk? I said, yeah. So we get on the phone, and he said, this is a powerful story. And I said, yeah, what's powerful about it? It's a bunch of rich white people that ended up with a homeless sister. It's not who we all think those people are. Those people we avert our eyes from looking at. Those people we look the other way when we're driving down the street because we don't acknowledge they're there. But they're your sons, daughters, brothers, and sisters. And so he took on the story. And so after about a month, he said, do you think Ashley and Hugh will participate? And I said, I don't know. It's one thing, I'm a 70-year-old guy. I don't really give a hoot what they say about me in the newspaper or so on. But these are two young professional people. They're 40-some years old. It's another thing to have on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, your mother's crazy and homeless. I mean, let's cut through all the stuff, right? So I got a hold of them and I said, hey guys, this is your call. Once again, I'm staging life, it doesn't matter. And they said, let's do it. Let's do it. So he worked on that story for 3-4 months. It was lengthy. He flew down to Palm Beach Gardens. He was checking this out. And he said, this is a powerful story because who it is, where she came from, what she did. And this is not the typical what we think of, homeless people. And Ashley and Hugh, they participated. And we did it, and it was a very interesting reaction the day the story came out. Molly and I were, I forget somewhere, we were outside of Atlanta, and all of a sudden it's the front page of the Wall Street Journal. It's a big piece, as you can see. I was like, whoa, I wonder how Ashley and Hugh are doing. So I called little Hugh. I said, how are you? Are you okay? He said, this is great. I said, really? He said, he was happily married, has a couple of kids, but his in-laws and the relatives and always friends had always wondered about, what's the deal with his mother? Why wasn't she at the wedding? Why is she never around? What's the real story of what went on here? And he said, it cleared the air. It took all this doubt away from people that are always wondering, was it me or what I had done or who I was? And it was interesting because his sister, Ashley, had the exact same response almost. She said, it's a relief. And she said, and it's a relief she died. Because it was a horrible life. It was the loneliest thing I could imagine. But I keep going back to the reason we did this was to make sure to create a pulpit, to talk about it, to put people's feet to the fire about who these people are, but also try to effectuate change. I guess the lobbyist in me comes out. We met the politicians, they all blah, 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 But no one can answer my question. Why does he go to the hospital and get medical care and I couldn't take my sister? She was incapable of agreeing or not agreeing to go. That's the whole point. So I appreciate you being here. I hope you'll keep that in mind about who those people are. Thank you for doing what you're doing to help them. And I don't have any magic answers, but we're going to try our best to, like I said, draw attention to it and hopefully affect some sort of change. So thank you very much. I think we're okay. I'll be glad to answer any questions. Any questions? Yep.
George, thank you for sharing that and your family's story with us. It's meaningful, and many of us don't really know the percentage of people who are mentally ill on the street, much less who else is on there, former service members and others. And it appears to me that many people are concerned about it, but we don't have the dollars to do something about it. Do you have any idea what the federal government does in terms of dollars to try and deal with and help progress here?
The honest answer is no.
I know how much is being spent on.
But can I tee up something that's actually in one of those articles I read? And I don't care what your politics are, Republican, Democrat, I don't really care. And when I mentioned California, California, California at least is trying. And they have passed what's called the CARE Act. And the CARE Act simply puts, in my sister's situation, it would allow a judge to be a judge. And what you could do is a cop, a relative, a social worker could actually go before a judge in California and say, this person needs medical attention, i.e. mental health attention. And the judge is empowered to put together a program, sort of, which involves them going to mental health treatment. They are the first to admit that if the person involved balks, fights, leaves, won't do it, it doesn't work. It's a beginning. I couldn't do that in the state of Florida. I couldn't go to a judge and say, would you order my sister to go get health care? And you'll also see in the AJ's opinion piece, I've worked with Catholic charities, and I met with community ministries, and I don't speak for them, so don't. But we've set up a homeless fund there. But what we're trying to do is get people like that, and they will tell you the CARE Act is not some panacea, but they'll say it's a beginning, it's a handle, it's a way to get the person, I couldn't get my sister in front of a judge. The judges couldn't help you unless I went for the nuclear option, which they said I probably wouldn't get. But as far as dollars and cents, the CARE Act, they will tell you, is too expensive. They're spending a lot of money on all sorts of things. But this one sliver of it, to me, was the opening I was looking for.
I'd like to ask you if this is a local, federal, state. Because
state.
We know the federal government is housing and feeding illegal immigrants in the millions throughout this country. But we can't take care of our own here. You are a former lobbyist. Help us understand.
It's a state issue. It's state law. It's a state issue. And it's those folks down there in the dome. That's their job. And the people in the city of Atlantic City council. It's a local issue. I guess you could make it federal if you wanted to, but California on their own is trying to do something about it, and they did it, state of California. And it's a mixed bag, whether it's working or not. And like I said, I'm the first one to tell you it's not a panacea, but I'd rather have something rather than nothing. That's where we are. Yeah, anybody else? Yeah.
There's a boy, a 40-year-old guy that's a friend of my son, who's also 40 years old, and this kid he's within a square mile of where we are here, and he sleeps. He's been on the street for 2 years, and they're so desperate. He's not as successful as your sister was, but he's a little more violent. Yeah. He gets a place to stay and then tears it up. And his parents are just beside themselves, and they're saying there's nothing you can do. And I was so desperate about it. I said, you ought to get him arrested.
Absolutely.
We ought to pin something on him. But he shoplifts. He's been banned from all the places here. He's right close to the church right here. And it's like, I couldn't believe I was saying that. I said, y'all need to do something and get him arrested and get him in the system.
Well, the jails are our mental institutions.
Excuse me?
The jails have turned into our mental institutions because that's the only place you can get them. And, I actually had the same wish for my sister who was convicted of shoplifting. In fact, the officers down there told me they'd picked her up one time. They spent a night. And then she'd done it again. And, they had a warrant. They could pick her up anytime. But he said, George, it doesn't do any good. We put her in the slammer for a night or two. Then she just goes back out. You're stealing $10 from CVS. But, yeah, that's the remedy we're left with. No, what you're saying is not irrational. That's the only way to get them off the street.
It just sounded irrational to me since I was saying that.
No, you're totally, no. We had the same discussion. Can we have a friend who had a mentally ill relative, and it was small town justice. It was a small town in South Carolina where the sheriff was sort of in cahoots with him in a good way. And they had the guy arrested for breaking in the family home so they could get him off the streets. And the sheriff was kind of winking and nodding, yeah, I'm going to arrest, but you can't do that in a big city. Yeah.
Housing for the homeless. And I haven't read anything where we're talking about mental health care, trying to deal with that.
Yeah, it's in there in the opinion piece.
Is there anyone trying to do that?
Yeah, once again, the CARE Act allows you a judge, but we don't have it here. And I've met with state legislators. I've met with, and they give you blah, 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 but they haven't done anything, Yeah. I'm not sure on that,
I just wondered, with the Rosalind Carter Center dedicated to working with mental health issues, if they were doing any actual research where you could
there's a lot of research being done in all sorts of pockets around the country. I'm familiar with some up in Boston that was going on with the sort of the United Way up there. There's a woman I've met with that was running it. But specifically the Carter Center, I'm not sure. Yeah.
So a few things. First, thank you very much for sharing. I would say, secondly, I really hope I don't have an aneurysm when I walk out into the parking lot.
I hope you don't either.
Didn't really want to put that out there in the ether, but I'll just retort that way.
We'll give us the okay. We'll make sure you get to the hospital.
Okay, thank you. And so, I guess a few questions. So, one, kind of tongue-in-cheek, did you stay at the Embassy Suites when you were down in Florida?
I stayed next door at the Marriott.
Yeah, okay. But really, I think and thank you for kind of bringing both the framework of the homelessness, right? I think I really liked the three different levels.
That's my theory. Yeah.
The financial and the abuse, right, and then the mental health portion. And I think that when you're an addiction, right, and so when you're in one of those, I think you find it easy to float into another. And we've kind of focused at least this discussion on how to help people once they're in those buckets. But I would also imagine that when you were going through it, you had to have some sort of, okay, what led us here? How did we get here?
Right.
Is this something that is innate, right, in my genes? Do I need to be looking out for signs? Or is this something that was, progressing all along the way? And I think your niece and nephew the same. So I'm curious to hear from you on those points.
Yeah. Well, my wife thinks I'm crazy, but that's a whole nother story. What happened, though, was on my sister, it was, you sort of look back on it, and what disguised it all was her beauty. She was a beautiful woman, and her success, right? And so, she would say things and sort of, well, that was a little crazy, or, but it grew as she got older, right? Like I said, look back when she was 20 or 25, and you say, well, that didn't make any sense then. But it sort of disguised it. She would float along because she was successful and impressive, and people were, trying to meet her. And it grew and grew, and it wasn't until, when she was about 40, I'm saying, that she really went off the rails, right? When she had the 2 kids, they were 8 and 10. And then she was, telling these fantastical stories about where she was going and what she was doing. She was working, secret co-op missions in Afghanistan. And, I said, when it gets to the point where your 94-year-old dad says, calls me up and says, you're going to need to take care of her. That's how, So, yeah, and I'm not sure if I answered your question, but we look back on it and we saw it was coming. It wasn't an overnight thing. It was not something that happened dramatically. It just evolved and evolved. And, her husband watched it as, over the 10 years or so they were married, saw her, once again, kind of going off the rails. And, 8 and 10-year-old kids, you can't force her to go get mental health treatment. And so she bails out and goes to California on them, yeah.
I'm Roy Wise. I'm from Redeemer, Atlanta, down at Peachtree and Fourth. My wife's a member here. We were married here. We alternate worship between the 2 churches. Love worshiping here. Our church down at 4th Street in Peachtree been feeding the homeless for something like 40 years. We give them a hot meal. It's one of the things we do. About a year ago, I said, okay, I want to learn about this. So I volunteer twice a month. The first thing I learned, these people are clean and nicely dressed. But it's the same people every time. I was there last Thursday with 100 people. I asked the guy on staff, how many people are new today? He said 2. So it's the same people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like this. It's still on.
There you go.
I go to on Zoom a Bible study for people, guys my age, on Tuesday at 7 o'clock and for an hour study.
You're a young guy like me.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And about a year ago, Czar, who was homeless, came. And he brought his friends. Now, a year later, Czar, Willie, George, they're still coming.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of an interesting situation. You got about a 6'8", guys my age, white, 6'8", black guys from the street, and a few of them on Zoom. And I learned a couple of things. These guys are serious about the Bible. They have a deep respect, and they're very knowledgeable. For example, you can ask some obscure Bible figure from the Old Testament, who's the father? A couple of those guys know. So it's been a real interesting little situation.
I've got a kind of a cute story. I was meeting with Catholic Charities about this. Like I said, we've set up a fund there for the homeless. And there was a guy, I'll make his name up, Charlie. Charlie would come to Catholic Charities and they would help him. And then Charlie somehow scammed somebody into towing this abandoned car to the parking lot where Catholic Charities was so he could live in the car and be right there. And so Charlie's in the car, and he'd come in every day like he's coming to work, right? And they said, so Charlie, the landlord, their building is rented, right? They don't own it. The landlord said, you got to take Charlie's car out of here. You can't leave Charlie living in the car. So they told Charlie that, they're going to have to take him out. They could never get Charlie to get mental health treatment, but he's their number one referral guy out in the streets. He sends all the people that say, Charlie sent me, and so Charlie's sort of like the number one referral guy out there. Yeah. Yeah.
There was an excellent piece on 60 Minutes about your CARE Act.
Yeah.
I would encourage everybody here to pull it up online and Google it, I'm sure. And I agreed with you. Who knows whether it will work, but it seems on the surface to make sense to me. It was something.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was a good piece. They had, the pros and the cons, and yeah.
You mentioned the 3 sections. You have the homeless, the addiction, and
Mentally ill.
the mentally ill.
Well, you have economic, addiction, and mentally ill. Those are the 3 that I'm no social scientist, but it's sort of the 3 big pillars out there.
Excuse me. Is there help for the addiction? Because we have a family member who has had the addiction situation. She moved from Florida, she moved to California, and now she's living where is she living now? I don't even remember now. But anyway, she's moved from place to place because the addiction situation she has was better in Florida than it was here. Then it was better in California, but then that fell apart, and now she's living in Colorado.
So, some of the places that maybe this gentleman who's just speaking, I'm sorry, I get your name, you're a lot of places that provide food and services will force you into addiction-related remedies. They sort of force you if you want to get the meal. But with the mentally ill, it's more difficult because, addiction is sort of identifiable, right?
Well, it's a disease.
It's a disease, too.
So there's some treatment for it, but like I said, she has moved from place to place looking for whatever she can find.
But
that was my question. The economic situation, there's no help for that. This gentleman was pointing that out. And there's really no help for the mentally ill, but we can help those with addiction.
Yeah,
Is that correct?
And many of these social service organizations will try to get people into programs to address it. And all I'm saying is, when they correct me if I'm wrong, Reverend, but someone comes in to get a meal, they'll say, okay, we'll give you a meal, but you got to go meet with the counselor here, who's addresses addiction-related things. It's sort of bribe you into, addressing it.
Yeah, I'd love to, and we're just about at time, but I'd love to address that topic just briefly and say that we have many social service agencies within Metro Atlanta. Some are affiliated with faith-based organizations. Others are not. I do know that there are certainly some agencies that have that policy that we will help you only if you will agree to go into a program, but we have many agencies that do not have that policy, that are open to anyone who comes in as long as they're not in a place of violence against themselves or others. And many of our partner agencies that we work with here at the Cathedral offer help for those who would like it with addiction, offer mental health services, again, because we don't have enough mental health providers around the country in general. There's usually a long waiting list for that, and our social service agencies, whether they are associated with federal or local government or associated with a private charity or a faith-based organization, are also just incredibly overrun these days, particularly since the pandemic. So that is a huge piece of the problem. And so I think it's a both and George, I just want to say in closing that that's one of the things that I so appreciate what you've shared with us today, is the importance of not stereotyping or lumping in individuals or groups just as all of us have come to this place today with our own stories and experiences in life that have contributed to who we are today and how we act and how we look upon the world and one another, it's the same way for the most vulnerable among us. And so if you are coming, and I hope you all will, to the Homeless Requiem on Friday, November 1st, there's a place for everyone. I don't want to say even just, but one of the most important things I think we can do that night is worship together and bear witness to the dignity of the lives of all those whom we are remembering. So please come if you can. And if you do get a chance to engage in conversation with one of our guests, I encourage you to do so, and not to feel afraid or worried that you're going to say the wrong thing, but simply to engage in conversation and give another person the gift of hearing their story. I think, as you pointed out, George, you may often be surprised at what some of those stories are.
Could I just say, my email, my website is georgefranklinauthor.com. If you got any comments, suggestions, criticisms, I don't care. Write me and let me know any questions about it. We've got the Wall Street Journal article. John Camp, he is a terrific reporter. And, feel free to contact him and tell him, I sent him. So he covers this extensively. And like your question, ma'am, about, drug addiction in places, John Camp can answer all that. He covers this extensive. He and I have been on panels together around the country. And he's a top-notch reporter. Don't hesitate to write him, too.
Thank you so much, George. And I think the practice in this class is that we stand and say the Lord's Prayer before we adjourn.
Right.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Thank you again, George.